And good Thursday morning to you. Welcome into the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. We start off this morning with some breaking news in a race that we have been tracking for well over a month now, that being the highly contested race for the North Carolina Supreme Court. We've got breaking news this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour to go over some additional legal proceedings. Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation is our guest this morning. Mitch, breaking news this morning surrounding the Supreme Court race. What are you tracking out of Raleigh?
The latest is that Republican candidate Jefferson Griffin, who trails in this race, is now going to the state Supreme Court, trying to get an order that would block the State Board of Elections from doing anything that would finalize this election. Now, as a reminder, Griffin is the Republican candidate running against Democrat Allison Riggs, who's the appointed incumbent. And as things stand now, Riggs is the leader in this race and would be the winner by about 730 votes out of more than 5.5 million votes cast. But Jefferson Griffin has challenged a number of ballots in this race, 60,000 plus ballots on a number of different grounds. And this latest court filing that came out Wednesday afternoon, late in the afternoon, just before the close of business from Jefferson Griffin, says that the State Board of Elections has acted unlawfully by counting some ballots that shouldn't have been counted. Ballots cast by people who registered to vote without providing a driver's license number or the last four digits of a social security number. Ballots cast by voters who've never lived in North Carolina. We're talking about the children of North Carolina residents living overseas. And also the third category, ballots cast by overseas voters who didn't provide a photo ID. Griffin launched challenges of all those votes. And in a meeting last week, the State Board of Elections voted against his protests, against his challenges. So now he's going to court asking for two things from the state Supreme Court, the court that he hopes to join. One is a temporary stay before Monday that would basically block the State Board of Elections from taking any further action in counting these ballots that have been challenged. And then two, after the stay, issuing what's called a writ of prohibition. And that writ would be an order that would block the State Board of Elections from counting any of the ballots that Griffin is challenging. This court document that's been filed basically has very harsh words for the State Board of Elections, saying that it's been acting unlawfully. And once it was pointed out that it was acting unlawfully, refused to do anything about it. And basically, Griffin is saying it's up to the courts, and not only the courts, the state courts, to do something about it. The reason that's important is that the North Carolina Democratic Party filed a federal lawsuit to have the federal courts deal with these challenges. Griffin has intervened as a defendant in this case, but he wants the state the state Supreme Court to be dealing with these issues rather than having it play out in the federal courts.
And the timeline on this is rather interesting, Mitch. We've got a State Board of Elections meeting on Friday. Of course, Christmas at this point, less than a week away. The end of the year, just a couple of weeks away. When we chatted last week about this State Board of Elections meeting, in which, for all intents and purposes, they kind of pushed all of Griffin's claims on these 60,000 votes aside, You told us at that point, based on some of the comments, it didn't seem like we would necessarily see any additional legal challenge. Why did this take so long, do you think, to come to fruition, and kind of burning the candle at both ends here with a timeline? The lawsuit filed on Wednesday night, and of course the state board meeting on Friday, and he's looking for the state Supreme Court to do something before Monday. This is a really compressed timeline here.
It is a compressed timeline. The document that was filed has almost 4,000 pages, so it might have taken all that time to do this, because remember, it was a week ago that the State Board of Elections rejected those challenges, and so it probably took his lawyers a while to get all of this stuff together to get before the state Supreme Court. But the timeline and asking for the temporary stay is because we are coming up on the end of the year. We are coming up on the State Board of Elections, coming up with some sort of decision about certifying this race. Remember, the appointment from Justice Allison Riggs is really only supposed to run through the end of the year, and then the newly elected justice, Riggs or Griffin would take office at the first of the year. So it's entirely possible that legal challenges will extend into 2025. But I think everyone would like to see some sort of resolution by the end of 2024 so the state Supreme Court can continue with a full slate of 7 justices as the new year starts.
With that, even obviously with them as with a full bench, this seems like it would be a situation if the Supreme Court does do something on this. Is it safe to say that current Democrat Justice and Allison Riggs would have to recuse herself from whatever happens there due to the fact that she's the opposite party in this case?
You would think she would almost have to do that. Now, of course, the rules that the state Supreme Court has for dealing with recusal is a justice decides him or herself whether to recuse. There was a whole fight about this a few years ago when it was thought that Democratic members of the court would try to block a couple of Republican members from dealing with a controversial case. That didn't end up happening. And what happened instead was that the court issued an order saying that decisions about recusal will stay with the justice who has been targeted for recusal. So it's entirely possible that if Allison Riggs said, no, I'm going to take part in this case, regardless of the fact that there would be a conflict of interest, she would have the right to do that. But one expects that because this deals directly with her and directly with the election to her seat, that she would almost have to recuse herself.
A couple more questions for you, Mitch. Yeah, the Supreme Court isn't always necessarily in session. There's periods of time in which they're not all there. What does this look like? I mean, is this something that they realistically, we're sitting here Thursday morning chatting about this, is this something realistically that they can take up in the next business day and a half leading into Monday? What is the kind of the practicality of some of that look like?
It's entirely possible that they could, because a temporary stay, which is what Griffin is seeking immediately, really would only require them to have a conversation among themselves, to take a vote and then put out an order. They would not have to write a multi-100-page opinion about this, though I suspect that if they do decide to do something about it, you'll probably get a very short court order from the majority and then probably a very lengthy dissent, if not from Riggs, perhaps from her colleague, Democrat Anita Earls. But that's something that wouldn't have to take that long. It would take a little bit longer for the court then to deal with this idea of the writ of prohibition. But you're right about the fact that the state Supreme Court is not always doing business. We know that it has no more arguments scheduled for this year. Last week was the week when it issued its last opinions for the year. It's not scheduled to have any more oral arguments until February, and not to issue any more opinions until March. So this is otherwise kind of a quiet period for the state Supreme Court. If it decides to get involved, it would be out of the norm for this time of year.
Final question for you. I mentioned that State Board of Elections meeting that is scheduled to take place Friday morning. Does this change any way that they handle this? I guess some of that is probably predicated on if we hear from the state Supreme Court later on in the day today on Thursday, or maybe very early on Friday. Does anything change for them as you understand it?
It's entirely possible. I have seen part of the schedule for the State Board of Elections meeting, and what the board was designed to deal with at that meeting were the election protests from Jefferson Griffin and from state legislative candidates dealing with issues that the state board didn't already address last week. These were the challenges that were left to county boards of elections to address. Felons voting, or someone who voted in early voting and then died before election day, or someone who voted even though he or she had been removed from the voting rolls. These were issues that the state board of elections left to county boards of elections. Now all those county boards have finished that work. It gets back to the state board of elections. The state board of elections was scheduled to deal with those issues at the meeting Friday. I don't know whether the board had planned, after dealing with those protests, to then certify the elections or to hold off and deal with that at a later meeting. But if there is some sort of order from the state Supreme Court between now and that elections board meeting, there would be no action taken on certifying elections until the whole thing is resolved. If there's no order from the state Supreme Court, perhaps the State Board of Elections takes some sort of vote on certification, but then the state Supreme Court could issue some sort of ruling that overturns that or blocks it.
There's a lot of moving pieces here, Mitch. We appreciate the update this morning. You can read more on this breaking news on our website this morning, carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:12, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time for a look at traffic on this Thursday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. We're looking great.
It's 5:19. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We are streaming live on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel this morning, as we are each and every weekday, and encourage you to check out our podcast. It's available wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour. Tap that subscribe or follow button and you'll get a new show delivered to your smartphone or tablet each and every weekday morning. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. Obviously, we spend a lot of time talking about statewide news. However, there is some federal news this morning that we are going to be talking about. You likely heard about it yesterday. This is the continuing resolution to keep the government open as House GOP leaders are scrambling this morning up in Washington, D.C., literally as we speak, to devise some sort of backup plan after this bipartisan agreement to avert a partial government shutdown was derailed by strong conservative opposition yesterday. Leading this on the tip of the spear, Elon Musk. The contentious 1,547-page legislation intended as a short-term expansion of the 2024 fiscal year budget has drawn an immense amount of criticism on social media over the last probably 12 to 16 hours or so in both chambers, both the House and the Senate. It was also publicly opposed by President-elect Donald Trump, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, and as I mentioned, Elon Musk. The bill, which aimed to fund the government through March the 14th, does include some important things for North Carolina. However, there is a lot of fat in this legislation. It includes about $100 billion in disaster aid for folks in western North Carolina, as well as folks in western Florida dealing with the impacts from Hurricane Helene and Milton. It includes $10 billion in aid for farmers, some healthcare reforms, a provision to revitalize Washington, D.C.'s RFK Stadium, a lot of things in this over 1,500-page bill. However, members of the House Freedom Caucus and other conservatives on Capitol Hill objected to last-minute additions that they consider unrelated policy riders. As of Wednesday night, the national debt had climbed to over $36.19 trillion, with $1.834 trillion in terms of a budget deficit from the prior fiscal year, ranking as the third highest in U.S. history. House Majority Leader Steve Scalise did confirm that the bill in large parts did collapse last night, with no new agreement reached as GOP leaders continued their work into the very early hours this morning, some probably still hanging out in offices on Capitol Hill as we speak right now. The failure to secure any sort of consensus on this has intensified division within the GOP, and there are now threats for House Speaker Mike Johnson's leadership ahead of a looming January speakership challenge. This is going to be a very interesting story to track over the next couple of days. Obviously, as you can imagine, members of Congress want to get home for Christmas. It's Thursday morning right now. Presumably, they've got just a couple of short days, maybe three into portions of Saturday, maybe Sunday at the latest, to get something on this done. If not, we are likely heading into a at least partial government shutdown. It's something that we'll continue to track here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, and all of the WBT hosts will continue to track throughout the day right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Where it's now 5:23. Taking a look at some other statewide news this morning, another federal tie as the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina has advanced a step closer to achieving full federal recognition. This is following the U.S.'s House approval of House Resolution 1101 in a vote of 311 to 96. The legislation, which was sponsored by Representative David Rouser, he's in the 7th Congressional District in North Carolina, also supported by Representative Richard Hudson, would provide the tribe with access to federal services and benefits, including healthcare, housing, and education. Hudson emphasized the Lumbee tribe's cultural contributions and historic roots in North Carolina, highlighting his own ties to Robeson County, which is the home to many of the Lumbee people. The tribe's previous federal recognition was granted back in 1956 under the Lumbee Act, however, was limited excluding them from benefits typically afforded to federally recognized tribes. This new legislation seeks to rectify this long-standing inequity. Outgoing Representative and Attorney General candidate Dan Bishop has also voiced strong support for this, commenting that the tribe's preservation and seeking justice in their dedication to education, notably through UMC Pembroke. However, despite strong partisan support in the House, as I just mentioned, the vote there 311 to 96. The bill did face some oppositions from Representative Virginia Foxx and Representative Chuck Edwards, both of those sitting Congress members here in North Carolina. Representatives Patrick McHenry, the Republican, and Representative Wiley Nickel, the Democrat, were absent, so they were no votes on that legislation. The resolution now moves its way to the Senate, where it does have strong backing from North Carolina Senators, both Thom Tillis and Ted Budd. However, opposition remains. Chief Michael Hicks of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians criticized the legislation, warning it undermines tribal sovereignty by lowering the standards for federal recognition. Hicks, in a statement yesterday, called for the Senate to block the resolution, citing concerns over the Lumbee tribe's lack of verified historical and cultural lineage. The debate does continue as the Senate prepares to take up this resolution in the final days of the congressional session, and kind of in hand with this continuing resolution. If this thing completely unravels and falls apart, this Lumbee tribe resolution, which I'll note is completely separate, could get caught up in some of the bickering up in Washington, D.C. We'll keep a close eye on that. And as we talked about that, we did get some comments from Representative Richard Hudson on the House floor earlier this week. This is what he had to say in favor of this House resolution, which would give the Lumbee tribe full federal recognition.
I rise in support of H.R. 1101, the Lumbee Fairness Act, which rights an historic wrong and provides long overdue federal recognition for the Lumbee tribe. My family goes back 7 generations in Robeson County, which is the home of the Lumbee people, and I represent many Lumbees in Hoke and Cumberland counties. The Lumbees have deep cultural roots and traditions in our state that have made significant contributions since North Carolina fully recognized the tribe in 1885. Though Congress recognized the Lumbee tribe in 1956, they were discriminated against like no other tribe and tragically denied the same protections and resources enjoyed by every other federal tribe. Since I came to Congress, I've proudly championed federal recognition, yet despite broad bipartisan support, Congress has failed to send this legislation to the President. This is unacceptable, and it's past time we right this wrong once and for all. I'd like to thank my friend, Representative David Rouser, for leading this must-pass legislation to give the Lumbee people the long overdue federal recognition they rightfully deserve. I'd also like to thank Chairman Bruce Westerman and his incredible hard-working staff. I urge my colleagues to join us in support of this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
And they did support that in the House. Again, 311 to 96 was the vote there. We'll get some comments from Representative Dan Bishop coming up a little bit later on this morning. It's now 5:27, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We will get another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick.
All right, it's 5:34. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Thursday morning to you. We are continuing with our breaking statewide news this morning. Republican State Supreme Court candidate Jefferson Griffin, in a legal challenge yesterday, is now asking the North Carolina's highest court, that being the Supreme Court, to issue an order blocking the state election officials from, quote, counting unlawful ballots from this most recent election. Griffin trails the appointed incumbent Democrat Allison Riggs by 734 votes in a race that has yet to be certified by the State Board of Elections. Now, the NCSBE is scheduled to meet tomorrow afternoon to address the last unresolved protests that Griffin filed in connection with the November general election. The board has already rejected most of the more than 300 protests that Griffin and the NCGOP have filed against more than 60,000 ballots statewide. A board spokesman responded to Griffin's latest complaint on Wednesday by pointing to a 43-page order that was issued back on December 11th, responding to some of Griffin's challenge. With this legal battle, Griffin is seeking a, quote, temporary stay before Monday, end quote, to give the state Supreme Court time to consider his request for a writ of prohibition. Griffin's lawyers filed a 3,992-page document yesterday afternoon detailing his request. The stay would block the state election board from certifying an election result favoring Riggs. It would also block a requirement that Griffin filed a petition for judicial review within 10 days of the election board's decision, saying in the lawsuit, quote, a temporary stay will protect this court's jurisdiction to decide the question of law that are raised in Judge Griffin's electoral protests and questions that our nation's system of federalism reserved for state courts, not federal courts. The North Carolina Democrat Party filed a federal lawsuit back on December 6th, focusing on Griffin's challenges of the various election ballots. Griffin intervened in that case as a defendant. The case sits in the U.S. District Court this morning. District Judge Richard Myers, that's in his courtroom currently. Griffin's court filing explained why he pursued an order beyond a temporary stay, saying, quote, Judge Griffin asks the court to exercise its power as granted by the North Carolina Constitution to supervise inferior tribunals such as the state board. Judge Griffin asks the court to issue a writ of prohibition that prohibits the State Board of Election from counting ballots cast in violation of North Carolina's statutes and Constitution. The State Board has continued to issue rulings and administer our elections in violation of North Carolina law, and the board's lawlessness cannot be allowed to continue. The State Board is an administrative agency that has knowingly broken the law and refused to do anything about it, according to Griffin's lawyers. Indeed, the board has been breaking our election law for decades. This lawlessness was brought to the board's attention back in 2023 before the 2024 general election, but the board refused to correct its errors. Now those chickens have come home to roost. In the 2024 general election, the board's errors changed the outcome of the election for an open seat on this court. When those errors were once raised again in valid election protests, the board then claimed that it was too late to fix its law-breaking. The court filing continued. The Griffin court filing highlighted three categories of election protests: voters who registered without providing a driver's license number or the last four digits of their social security number; 2, voters who have never lived in North Carolina; and 3, overseas voters who did not provide photo identification. As I mentioned, the state election board meeting is scheduled for Friday and is set to deal with some of these protests from Griffin and 3 Republican legislative candidates on issues other than those spelled out in Griffin's legal filing yesterday. The state board tasked County Board of Elections with addressing protests involving possible voting by felons, voters that cast the votes that were cast by people who died before Election Day and votes cast by people who had been removed from the voting rolls. In a December 11th meeting, the State Board of Elections did reject the three groups of protests that Griffin mentioned in his latest complaint. The Democrat Majority Board did vote 3-2 to reject those protests based on incomplete voter registration data and non-resident voters. The board voted unanimously to reject protests involving overseas voters who did not provide a valid photo ID. That is something that we'll continue to track throughout the rest of the week. Obviously, this meeting is going to happen on Friday. If there are any pertinent details, we'll have it for you coming up early next week ahead of Christmas right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:40 and tracking some other statewide news this morning. The North Carolina Office of State Auditor has released a critical report exposing serious oversight failures by the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services Division of Health Service Regulation. That entity, that group, is responsible for overseeing state nursing homes. The audit identified three key issues: delayed inspections, untimely investigations of complaints, and inadequate verification of corrected deficiencies, all of which placed nursing home residents at significant risk, according to the auditor's office. Between March 1st, 2021 and December 31st, 2023, 68% of nursing homes experienced delayed inspections. Out of 425 nursing homes in the state, that's over 289 of them, with 39 facilities going more than 20 months without inspection, almost a year and a half, far exceeding the federal 15-month guideline. Higher risk facilities faced similar delays, with inspections ranging from 6.1 to 7.3 months, surpassing the 6-month limit that is in place. The audit also found that from January 1st, 2019 to December 31st, 2023, 39% of required complaint investigations were not completed within the legally mandated 60-day timeline, and 38% were not initiated on time at all. One example cited in the auditor's report was a delayed investigation into a lift-related injury that left a resident hospitalized and requiring surgery. The investigation was completed 85 days late, exposing residents to prolonged unsafe conditions. Furthermore, the Division of Health Service Regulation failed to adequately verify corrections of 37% of sampled deficiencies between January 1st, 2019 and June 30th, 2022. Notable failures included significant medication errors, where residents missed critical treatments for conditions like diabetes, heart issues, and seizures. The North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services attributed many of these issues to COVID-19 related challenges, such as staffing shortages and health risk. However, the auditor's recommendation that the division conduct timely inspections and complaint investigations in compliance with state and federal laws, perform a formal need analysis to identify necessary resources, improve procedures for verifying corrections, and enhance crisis preparedness and oversight of facilities not subject to federal regulations. In response, Mark Benson, who is the Chief Deputy Secretary for Health at NCDHHS, disputed the findings, arguing that North Carolina met or exceeded annual performance measures set by the Federal Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, outperforming many southeastern states. Despite this defense, the audit highlights some systematic weaknesses within nursing home oversights and underscores the urgent need for reform to ensure resident safety. There is a lot more on this report that we didn't have a chance to get into this morning. Our good friend Teresa Opeka has the story this morning. You can read additional details by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. It's now 5:43, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, Nick, thank you, sir.
Huh?
Good morning again. It's 5:50. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. We are continuing to track a drama and a controversy out of Capitol Hill this morning as House GOP leadership is scrambling to devise some sort of backup plan after a bipartisan agreement into a continuing resolution to avert a partial government shutdown was derailed yesterday. The highly contentious 1,547-page legislation intended as a short-term expansion of the fiscal year 2024 budget has drawn an incredible amount of criticism from conservatives and Republicans in both chambers up in Washington, D.C., as well as by President-elect Donald Trump, Vice President-elect J.D. Vance, and Elon Musk, who spent a large portion of his day yesterday on X railing the legislation. The bill, which aimed to fund the government through March the 14th, does include some things, including $100 billion in disaster aid for folks in western North Carolina, as well as portions of western Florida that are still attempting to recover from Hurricanes Milton and Helene. $10 billion in aid for farmers, some health care reforms, provisions to revitalize Washington, D.C.'s RFK Stadium. Lots of fat in this legislation that's over 1,500 pages. However, members of the House Freedom Caucus objected to the last-minute additions to the legislation that they considered unrelated policy riders. As of Wednesday, the national debt had climbed to over $36 trillion, with this year's budget deficit being $1.83 trillion, ranking as the third largest in U.S. history. House Majority Leader Steve Scalise did confirm that the bill, for all intents and purposes, collapsed yesterday. And as of right now, there is no new agreement in place as GOP leaders worked into the overnight hours early this morning. The failure to secure any sort of consensus has intensified divisions within the Republican Party, and you've got many lawmakers now calling on House Speaker Mike Johnson's head, for all intents and purposes, ahead of a leadership vote that is taking place in portions of mid-January, where he is likely to be challenged for House Speaker, depending on how this continuing resolution shakes out. With that, again, there has been many calls for additional federal disaster relief, and lawmakers are saying, hey, if we need disaster relief, run that as a separate piece of legislation and we'll pass it. Don't bury it in this 1,547-page continuing resolution to keep the federal government open through March. A lot of additional details are likely to come out throughout the day today. We'll continue to track it and provide additional details coming up for you tomorrow morning right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. In some other statewide news this morning, well, it is federal news, but it has a major statewide connection. The Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina is one step closer to achieving full federal recognition. This is following a resolution that was approved by the U.S. House earlier this week in a vote of 311 to 96. The legislation, which was sponsored by Representative David Rouser out of the 7th Congressional District, would provide the Lumbee Tribe with access to federal services and benefits, including health care, housing, and education. The tribe's previous federal recognition, which was granted back in the mid-1950s under the Lumbee Act, was limited. It excluded the Lumbee tribe from benefits typically afforded to federally recognized tribes. This new legislation would give them full federal recognition. Outgoing Representative Dan Bishop voiced strong support for the legislation, commenting on the tribe's perseverance in seeking this recognition, as well as their dedication to education, notably through UNC Pembroke. Despite the bill having broad bipartisan support, 311 to 96, the bill did face some no votes, including that of Representative Virginia Fox and Representative Chuck Edwards, who voted no to the legislation. The resolution now moves its way to the Senate, where it does have some strong support from Senators Tom Tillis and Ted Budd. However, this continuing resolution could cause some issues up in D.C. that could cause this resolution to maybe not make its way forward for a vote. We'll keep an eye on that. However, opposition does remain to this. Chief Michael Hicks of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians criticized the legislation, warning that it undermines tribal sovereignty by lowering standards for federal recognition. Hicks called for the Senate to block the resolution, citing concerns over the Lumbee tribe's lack of verified historical cultural lineage. With that, we did hear some comments on the House floor earlier this week from Representative Dan Bishop in support of that legislation.
I thank the gentleman, and Mr. Speaker, this is my final week in Congress, and many come to the floor and ruminate over their service. As for me, I can't think of a better way to spend my final words on the floor than in support of recognition for the Lumbee tribe. The Lumbee have been pursuing justice since the mid-1800s. As I've previously stated on the floor, some of the specifics of the Lumbee's Native American heritage, their struggle as a people against racial discrimination, and their deep and abiding community orientation around the life-changing power of education, especially represented by UNC Pembroke. I've talked about their rich tribal culture, the tribal council, the Warriors Ball, Lumbee Homecoming, the powwow. I count among my greatest privileges in Congress having been designated an honorary Lumbee warrior. I've explained the abomination of the recognition legislation of 1956, which acknowledged the Lumbee's nationhood while explicitly denying them the incidents and benefits of the status extended to other American Indian tribes, the epitome of arbitrary and capricious governmental action. And although Robeson County, the historic home place of the Lumbee, passed into Mr. Rausser's district in 2022, Lumbee recognition remains the unfinished business that is closest to my heart. I've been pleased to help introduce President Trump to the Lumbee and am proud to count him a vocal supporter of this legislation. I'm certain that progress toward righting this historic injustice has occurred over my 5 years in the House.
That's Representative Dan Bishop up in Washington, D.C. That's going to do it for a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. We'll be covering Roy Cooper's farewell address coming up tomorrow morning. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back tomorrow morning, 5 to 6, right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.